was going to go around the Earth, test out the lunar module. But towards the end of 1968, or actually about the summer of 68, Grumman Aircraft building the lunar module admitted that they could never get it ready by a flight in 1968. And so another thing happened. We had intelligence information at that time that the Russians were going to put a man or two men on a circumnavigating flight around the moon. They were serious about it. This was not something that we heard. They were actually planning to put two men around the moon because they knew, of course, our program was quite open. And so they were going to try to leapfrog and beat us. They put a proton booster, a booster big enough and strong enough to send a spacecraft called ZOND, Z-O-N-D, around the moon with animals, small animals, in I think the early fall of '68. The spacecraft went around the moon, came back to the Earth, but in its approach through the atmosphere, which has to be, because of the velocity coming back, has to be very careful and very accurate. They were not that good in their navigation, and when they picked up the spacecraft in the Pacific, the animals had died. But they were very concerned people. They weren't going to put people up into space until they could prove that they could bring them back alive. So they sent ZOND 6 up later on in the fall. And this spacecraft came back, landed in the Pacific, and to better results. And they were planning now to figure out, well, should we send another one up before we put in, and Leonov was going to be the guy that was going to go. And he said, well, they hesitated. In the meantime, due to the great leadership here in this country, with no lunar module, a command module, that if Apollo 7 would go around the Earth and prove to be a good vehicle, we will then send, that was in November, we will then send Apollo 8 to the moon. 7 was successful. I changed my whole plans. I finally found myself at MIT learning the new navigation. This is not going around the Earth, but we had to go that 240,000 miles. And as you all know, it was a very successful flight. I will mention more about that in my response tonight if I can. But that flight was probably the high point of my space career. Apollo 13 was, of course, the most challenging. But being the first out to the moon, it really changed my thoughts about everything.
Well, yeah, just, I mean, you're going to say more about it later, but what was that like seeing, as you were going to the moon, looking back and seeing Earth, first people ever see that scene?
Yeah. Well, the Earth was entirely different and a lot smaller. I looked at it, and thought to myself, my gosh, all my friends and everybody, that's where I live. My family's down there. It's a little blue and white ball. The Earthrise pictures that you've all seen, it was taken with a telescopic lens, so I mean, it looks bigger on the photograph than it really is. And so we thought that that was really a unique experience to do that. The moon itself, we were looking at the moon, and I'll mention something that I'm kind of proud of. During our training for Apollo 8, we had photographs of the lunar surface, of course. And as we looked at what our trajectory was going to be like going around the moon, because we're looking at landing in the Sea of Tranquility for the landing flight, and we wanted to do the same type of course trajectory. There was a little triangular mountain on the near side of the moon, on the shore of the Sea of Tranquility. And it was a little triangular mountain that pointed directly to where we thought and what actually happened, where Apollo 11 would land. So during the training, I decided to name that little mountain Mount Marilyn. after my wife, naturally. And I wanted to have, you know, good friends at home, I did. And so it was Mount Marilyn, and unofficially. And on Apollo 8, we went around and sure enough, passed Mount Marilyn, and we talked about it going down. Then on Apollo 10, which was the flight that went to the moon, and his program was to start the descent, then do an abort. That was part of the regular program. They used Mount Marilyn, took a picture of it, and everything was fine. And on Apollo 11, Neil Armstrong used Mount Marilyn as the initial point for starting the descent into the Sea of Tranquility. Mount Marilyn got a life of its own. It was in books, it was in the movie. You can Google it if you want to. In July of 27th of last year, yeah, thanks. No, July 27th, yes, of last year, the International Astronomical Union officially named that little triangular mountain, Mount Marilyn. So, although it has a name of its own now, but to my wife, it will be there now and in perpetuity, I guess. Wow. On Gemini 7, a 2-week mission to find out how man could live in zero gravity. Many doctors didn't think that was possible, but we did. 2 weeks in a little capsule, smaller than a Volkswagen minibus or just more than a car. And when we got back on the carrier, you know, holding hands, we said that we were engaged. Okay, Apollo 13.
You might have named Mount Marilyn something different.
Yeah.
It would be Mount Marilyn.
Apollo 13. Bad omens and bad luck from the beginning. Years before the flight, the spacecraft, as it was being built, had installed a damaged liquid oxygen tank. And it had been dropped at the factory. Factory people picked it up and made it sure that it would work fine for everything that it had to do to go to the moon. What they didn't do was to see if the little plumbing inside that tank was damaged, and that plumbing was only used to remove the oxygen on test long before it had ever gone to the moon. If they had to fill it up with oxygen and they wanted to take it out in some test. They never checked that. It was originally designated for Apollo 10 because it was delayed in delivery. It was signed to Apollo 13. The Apollo spacecraft flew with a 28-volt DC system. The little heaters inside the liquid oxygen tanks And they were used, the heaters were used occasionally during the flight to boil off a little liquid oxygen to feed the spacecraft itself for its various things. Were protected by thermostats that were capable of handling 28-volt power. Around 1965, NASA, or the manufacturer, I don't know which, told the manufacturer of the liquid oxygen tanks to replace those thermostats with thermostats that were capable of handling 65-volt power, because at the Cape there was availability of 65-volt power, so if they just wanted to check one thing in the spacecraft and not turn up the spacecraft's power system, they could plug it in and use it. The manufacturer never complied with the directive. Worse still, NASA never checked that the directive was completed. 2 weeks before the flight, we did what was known as a countdown demonstration test. The spacecraft is all set to go. It's standing on sitting on top of of course, the Saturn V booster. Booster's not fueled at all, but in the spacecraft, everything is fueled: liquid oxygen, liquid hydrogen, everything had to go. The crew gets into the spacecraft. The launch crew gets into their consoles, and we count down the time all the way to 0 to make sure that everything in the spacecraft functions at the proper time. Power comes off, internal power, the navigation system comes, oxygen starts to flow into the system. Test was a complete success. After the test, the ground crew went to the spacecraft and started to secure the spacecraft. One of their jobs was to remove the liquid oxygen from the 2 tanks. And when they tried to remove the liquid oxygen from the damaged tank, it didn't come out. Then they thought a while, well, why don't we put the 65-volt ground power that we have and boil the oxygen out? It worked fine for everything. We'll just let the heater system boil the oxygen out. They did. What they didn't know was the fact when the temperature inside that liquid oxygen tank, now liquid oxygen is about 200 and some odd degrees below 0, but when it got up to 80 degrees in that one certain spot at the top of it, the little points on the thermostat started to open up to shut off the power and protect it. But it was 65-volt power, not 28-volt power, and the little contacts were welded shut. We know now from tests after the flight that the temperature got up to around 400 or 500 degrees Fahrenheit inside that tank. It's amazing that the tank never burst. Nothing happened. The oxygen was removed quite rapidly, they thought, but it damaged the inside of the tank, exposed all the wires and damaged the heater system completely, but no one was concerned because there was nothing to show that there was anything wrong. The day before the launch, we filled up the tank with liquid oxygen, and it was a bomb waiting to go off, and that's how it all started.
So that's the background. From there, you get into the lifeboat situation, just trying to get home from there. What was that like? Those moments, those days trying to get back.
Well, we didn't get in the spacecraft when we found out 4 days before the launch that our entire crew had been exposed to the measles. I told you about bad omens. The doctors looked at our medical records and found out that Fred Hayes and I, having measles as kids, and our kids had the measles too, we were immune to the disease. Ken Manley was a bachelor. Never had any kids with measles, never had the measles himself. So he was dropped and Jack Slacker was put on board. That was the beginning of it. That was the second omen. But we launched on April 11th, 1970, at 13:13 Central Standard Time. You see a scenario? We took off on that big Saturn V. The first stage, of course, worked perfectly. When its fuel was expended, we dropped it. We lit the 5 engines on the second stage of the Saturn V. 2 minutes and 13 seconds before it should have, the center engine shut down. Do we have a crisis? What's wrong? Do we have enough fuel to keep going? To give Mission Control a lot of credit, they quickly looked at the situation, looked at the remaining thrust we had on the second stage and the fuel and the thrust we had on the third stage, and said, yep, we can still go. And so we got into Earth orbit, checked our spacecraft, then lit the third engine the second time to get us all the way to the moon. Actually put us on the proper course and a proper speed of about 24,000 miles an hour. And we got into a long elliptical orbit all the way to the moon. Except on April 13th, the night of April 13th down here, just after I finished doing a TV program to show all the people of the world what we were doing, of which none of the networks carried, the tank exploded. And from then on, it was not the third landing on the moon, but one of survival. A really great book. Anyway, we did an analysis of it. We did the dump tapes. We had audio of the three of us talking behind the moon when we didn't dump it back to the Earth, but it was kept on the spacecraft. And the way it went was this: the Earth came up on the right side of the two forward parts of the command module, and I saw it first and came up, and then Frank saw it, but then we rolled a little bit, and the thing came across to the left window, and then I told Bill, because Bill was the official quote photographer on this flight. And I said, Bill, look, we got to get this. And so the way I finally end up talking about this is, I am the director showing Bill how to focus the camera with the proper speed, and be sure you get the lunar surface at that right angle. And oh, by the way, here's where you push it. Anyway, Bill Anders took the picture, and forever and ever, Bill Anders, in perpetuity, will be known as taking that Earthrise picture.
Frank said it was his camera.
Mind of something, and keep at it. And many times, you'll succeed even though you don't know about it. I have, well, my life, I applied for the Naval Academy 2 times. I was rejected the second time, and I applied to go to NASA. It was, I'd float and had to do 2 times to that. And I couldn't go to college, and unfortunately, the Navy had a program for naval aviators that allowed me to go to college, and that's the only reason why I got to college, and then the only reason why I finally got the Naval Academy, and why I finally got into testing airplanes, and while finally NASA needed needed people that tested airplanes because they felt that was the proper type. Actually, it was Eisenhower that told NASA about the type of astronaut. In the beginning, they were looking at stuntmen from Hollywood. Seriously. Or they were even thinking about having double amputees, because the legs are useless, and that saves weight. And that's the way they were thinking. But Eisenhower said, look, a lot of that stuff that they're working with now is confidential, and they need a security clearance. So why don't you pick a test pilot? It's going to have some areas that are going to be risky, have to think, you know, what direction should I go to minimize the risk? You don't ask for risk. I mean, what you do is you set your course in a position so that you want to get the job done, whatever it's in. You want to build up things slowly but surely. You want to have a stable life, but then, you know, but you got to do risk. Will the job be a good one that I'm joining right now? You know, is the space program something that's going to run out of money in about 3 years? And here I am, you know, trying to go into a career in the Navy, and then I get stuck in this so-called space program, and the Navy says, well, that's too bad, you wanted to go that way, and that's risk. So everything in life is risk, and you just have to settle down, take a deep breath, and look at the best answer and charge from there.